Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special production of the Empty the Bench Network. Tom Albano here, along with Nick Morgasen, your host on ETV Sports every week, joined by a couple of guests. One being Zain Bando, my co-host on the MMA Outsiders every week here on the Empty the Bench Network. The other is Bradley Locker. Bradley, you can follow on Twitter at Bradley_Locker. He's the co-editor-in-chief of InsideNU, SBNation site. He is a member of the class of 2025 at the Medill School of Journalism over at Northwestern. Actually also a contributor to one of the Pittsburgh Steelers SBNation sites too. Isn't that correct, Bradley?
Yep.
All right. The reason I have Bradley here, co-editor-in-chief of the InsideNU, and Zain here. Zain is actually was a graduate student, graduated with his master's in journalism from the school just recently. Obviously, the big story that everyone is talking about right now with the sports world, which Nick Morgasen and I discussed on Empty the Bench on episode 191, is the situation that has blown up over at Northwestern. For those who are unaware, sleeping under the rocks for whatever reason, Northwestern has fired its football coach, Pat Fitzgerald, following allegations of hazing, and then major allegations of hazing. Long investigation, was suspended for 2 weeks, then changed to fired. And what was uncovered, with the likes of the Daily Northwestern and Bradley here with InsideNU have picked up on, as well as the national outlets now, all the hazing, all the details of it, which is multi-stage, complex, and just out of this world. Sexual misconduct allegations, racism allegations, basically a toxic culture had been cultivated around the football team, and it would even stretch just all of athletics. You have one report from a local radio station in Chicago about the baseball team also being under investigation for stuff like this. So that's why we have Bradley here, because Bradley boots on the ground reporting with this. And Bradley, just to get things started, just talk about like how you picked up on what was going on. Where did you first hear about these allegations?
Sure. Well, thanks, guys, for having me on. And really, we did not hear anything on the media sites really until the investigation summary was released. We had no idea that the punishment was going to be 2 weeks for Fitzgerald, nor the conclusions, what they were going to be, that hazing was found to have occurred in the program, but notably that Fitzgerald did not know. He had an opportunity to know, is effectively what Maggie Hickey, the lead investigator, determined. And again, there was radio silence from the time this investigation started in December. We didn't even know it was occurring until January. Had no idea the results were going to be announced in early July. And then I think everything really opened in terms of the floodgates when the Daily Northwestern's groundbreaking story, which featured I believe 2 former players, one of whom was the whistleblower, just detailing, again, the very graphic and severe nature of these allegations of hazing, which you guys kind of outlined already. And then I think additional reporting kept coming in. We heard from multiple former staffers. I believe that was Wildcat Report talked to multiple former staffers confirming these behaviors had occurred. I heard from multiple former players that said that they saw these behaviors, and one even told me that this was happening as early as the time he was there, and he graduated in 2007. And then, of course, there was additional reporting which factored in the element of racism, which my co-editor-in-chief, Iggy Dowling, spoke to a player about that. The Daily Northwestern had a story about that. And I think that's kind of the timeline and how it was accelerated starting on Saturday with the Daily Northwestern. And then more players certainly felt comfortable coming forward, and very grateful to those players that were courageous enough to speak up and share their stories, because, of course, it's not an easy thing to do, especially with a coach who was as beloved as Fitzgerald.
So what's crazy about this, and we obviously talked about this on episode 191 of Empty the Bench, the running incidents and the whiteboards. One, what do you make of these running incidents? And two, what do you make of the whiteboard, which everyone is so afraid to, I don't know if the exact word is afraid, but to show what was on the whiteboard?
I mean, in terms of the running, it was definitely a disturbing act to read about it. And a lot of people have claimed that it's almost kind of movie-like. And I definitely agree. It almost seems like an exaggerated, almost hyperbolic. I shouldn't say they count exaggerate. I feel like the behavior itself seems very dramatic and something that seems ritualistic almost. But the running itself was, again, very disturbing to read about. And in terms of the whiteboard, I did speak to a recent former player who told me he saw the whiteboard as well. And that has now been confirmed, I believe, by multiple former players that the whiteboard existed. And I think the reason the whiteboard has not been published is that I'm sure the details of that were graphic or identified specific players. And again, the last thing that people want necessarily in this situation is for specific players to be attached to this situation if they do not want their own identities associated with it. So based on what I believe ESPN's Adam Rittenberg shared, because I believe he got a picture of the whiteboard, I believe players' specific names were on there, and that's why we haven't seen the whiteboard. And I don't expect that we will see that, but again, both of those very alarming and disturbing for sure.
And Zan, the reason we have you here, because I want to get your thoughts on, as a Northwestern alumnus, just what were you making of this as somebody who has connections to the university, but was more, since you had just graduated, I guess the word on the outside looking in.
Yeah, more on the outside looking in. I also did graduate from the Medill School of Journalism. So the first thing I want to say is I want to compliment all of the different journalism that's gone out about this story. Literally, if it wasn't for my school and Bradley School, quite frankly, I don't think this story would have gotten as big as it is, number one. And number two, I just think it's a sad situation all around. I think it's sad in terms of, the morale of the football program, sad in terms of, what's come out, just kind of the whole mystique. As Bradley kind of alluded to, Fitzgerald was beloved by a lot. And, it's one of those things where I just feel like, and Bradley can probably attest to this, we really didn't hear a ton until Saturday night when more of the stuff started to come out and more stories were coming out. And truly, if it wasn't for the journalism that was done on this story, I don't think it would have gotten as big as it did. And I just think truly it's been a very sad week for the university, and it's going to take a long time to recover. And I think there are a lot of people at fault, which is what, InsideNU and the Daily Northwestern and several other outlets have tried to uncover. I even wrote a story about this, just kind of chronicling the timeline of everything that had gone on, just because it was such a complex story and just a lot's taken. So truly, from an outsider perspective, I think it's sad on all fronts, but from a journalistic perspective, if it wasn't for the Medill School, I don't think this story would have gotten as big as it has.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Now, other things that were kind of interesting, the Shrek clap was another thing that was very bizarre in my opinion, and now we're having conflicting reports. Did Pat Fitzgerald know what was going on? Did he not know what was going on? And Tom and I talked about, does this have a little bit of Penn State and Joe Paterno vibe connected to this? Because Paterno kind of acted like he didn't know what was going on, but he's responsible because he's the head coach. Would Fitzgerald fall in that role of saying he might not know, but he's responsible because he's the head coach? Or not, Bradley?
Yes. I mean, that's what I would say. And I think that's what a lot of former players that I've spoken to have said. The recent former players said that he has a responsibility to know what was happening in his program. And I believe President Schill also said the same thing in his statement regarding why Fitzgerald was fired. And regarding the Shrek clap, the former player that I talked to said that he saw the Shrek clap done by Fitzgerald multiple times. I believe he said it happened actually frequently. That it was kind of a long, slow clap over one's head. The player did say that he was unsure, I guess, how Fitzgerald was using it in terms of whether it was going to signify to a player that he was going to be involved in running, but whether or not the player told me he did see it occur multiple times, which again corroborates what the initial reports were from the Daily Northwestern. So again, I think it's pretty clear in some capacity that Fitzgerald was aware of what was happening, whether or not one wants to believe the Shrek clap allegations. But the bottom line is that he, again, oversaw every single aspect of Northwestern football. He had a responsibility to know what was happening in his own locker room, even outside of the program, and especially for fostering a workplace environment in which players felt comfortable doing this with one another. And I think that's the bottom line. And I think that's what some people are failing to understand, that even if Fitzgerald didn't know, he needed to have known.
And
right. So,
go ahead. No, you go.
Okay. Right. And just to kind of follow up on that, Bradley, you can clarify this, because I've seen both. From what you're reporting and what you're aware of, was the Shrek Lab done just in practice realms, or was it also done significantly during games as well?
I did not necessarily hear about when it was used. The player just told me that he saw the Shrek clap and Fitzgerald used to do it for sure. But I did not hear specifically the situations in which it occurred. But I believe the Daily Northwestern said it happened in practice a lot.
Okay.
And my question was going to be more along the lines of thinking about this investigation, what the school did, where it hired the third party firm, basically couldn't necessarily verify everything that had taken place, but said enough evidence had built up to the point where there had to be something that had been going on. The university responding with, a 2-week suspension for Pat Fitzgerald. My question is kind of twofold. Number one, how was it that basically nobody really knew about what had been going on until those reports were first released on Saturday night? And number two, why have this 2-week suspension and then backtrack to basically firing? And I know the president of the school came out and basically said, "Oh, we kind of screwed up in terms of delegating a punishment." But a 2-week suspension, especially during the off season, versus a firing, is two different major kinds of punishments.
I would say I think it's very unlikely that the university and President Schill, athletic director Derek Gregg, were not aware of the details of the hazing. I'm sure they emerged in the report. Again, it was a 6-month investigation. I believe Hickey talked to over 50 current and former players, staff members, and went through, I think it was thousands of documents as well. So I would, again, call it implausible that Hickey did not uncover what actually happened. I think it was more of a situation where the university knew what happened. There were the investigation included that Fitzgerald did not know, had an opportunity to know. And I think that Schill, again, understanding how prevalent of a figure Fitzgerald is, how well respected he had been within Northwestern, did not want to just fire him altogether because he probably knew it would have sparked significant outrage. But I think that it was more of a thing of mutual agreement between Schill and Fitzgerald. Here's a 2-week suspension. Clearly, you had a responsibility in knowing this, but of course, many would say this was kind of just a cover up, a slap on the wrist that even if Fitzgerald did not know, of course, again, he should have known. And I think again, I don't think that Schill learned of all of the details after the reporting. I think it was more he realized that people were starting to come out with outcries about how can you only suspend this man for 2 weeks, detailing, again, the coercive, severe nature of these allegations. And at that point, he vacillated and made it a much longer punishment, of course, just him being fired ultimately.
I mean, you mentioned the president. This is a question I asked Tom the other night. The president needs to be held responsible for some of this situation, at least in my opinion, because it seems like he didn't take any action originally. And we saw a bunch of PR statements, which, in my opinion, were a load of BS, in my opinion. But what did you make of the PR statements by the school? Because they seemed a little generic.
Yeah, generic is one word. I think for me, just the timing of everything was certainly questionable. I mean, in the first place, announcing Fitzgerald's initial punishment on a Friday morning was definitely a curious attempt. And Northwestern has done that before. I mean, trying to release statements that are notable Friday afternoons, especially, so that people can seemingly forget about them going into the weekend. And then, of course, the fact that Schill released his updated statement Saturday around 11 p.m. saying that he failed to consider what Fitzgerald should have known as opposed to what he did know, and that he may have erred in his punishment. Again, releasing that statement on a Saturday night, I mean, the average college student on a Saturday night is probably not concerned with that type of statement, and a lot of adults probably wouldn't be as well. So again, I think it's another curious attempt by the university to put out a statement maybe at a time where the audience would not have been as engaged. But on the PR side of things, I think pretty unilaterally it would be viewed as a disaster on all accounts that again, Schill released initial punishment, had to follow up with a statement only well after lots of reports had come out about, again, the details of what had occurred. And I think things that had definitely swarmed out of control. And the other big thing I'll say is that there really has been no communication from athletic director Derek Gregg. We have basically not heard from him throughout the entirety of the situation, which is alarming for somebody who is as powerful as he is in a Big Ten athletic director's role. And on top of that, of course, the news about Northwestern baseball, as you guys mentioned, and Gregg's potential involvement in a nebulous hiring process regarding Jim Foster. Again, have not really heard from anything regarding Gregg in that department. And it could just be that he and Schill are conferring about what's next, maybe regarding his own job, what type of statement they want to put out altogether, maybe on behalf of Schill. But it seems like any statement has come from Schill. Schill said, for example, that the decision to fire Fitzgerald was his entirely, after conferring with boards of trustee members and other faculty and leadership on campus. But radio silence effectively from Derek Gregg, and the statements that were put out from Schill the timing of them certainly eye-opening.
I guess I can follow that up with a two-parter then. Number one, because you mentioned that the athletic director has not said anything, and now we have reports of, two major sports where there's investigations into toxic cultures. What does that say for the athletic department as a whole? Let me just go with that one first before I get into the other part of my question.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying Greg was hired in May 2021 after another very controversial hiring process involving scandals and harassment from Mike Polisky, who was in line to be the next athletic director, had been hired and had to step down very shortly thereafter because of his knowing of and basically dismissing of claims of sexual harassment from Northwestern cheerleaders. So that hire was already mired in controversy. And I think in Greg's 2 years at the school, of course, there has been success with women's sports, lacrosse, field hockey, winning national titles. But when you consider the fact that he likely enabled coaches to create, as you guys mentioned, toxic, abusive cultures in not just one sport, but two that are very notable, football, of course, being the most prominent and revenue driving, it definitely makes one wonder how much Greg knew, why he was not stepping in or checking in with players on both sides of the programs involved. And apparently, according to 670 The Score, when Greg conducted the HR investigation regarding Jim Foster, he did not speak to any players whatsoever. And again, that it makes one just curious why that was the case, because you would figure the players would have the most up-to-date, pertinent information about the situation. So lots of questions swirling about Greg. And of course, there's a question whether or not he's going to remain as the AD too.
And I guess that actually is going to be basically my follow-up, is to basically what the heck is going to be in the future of Greg, and what really is going to be, how bad of a look this is right now for Northwestern, especially considering that we are about a month and a half out from college football season, and they're coming off of a season where, it hasn't been a good look. As you mentioned, Greg, when he became the AD, already off of a controversial hiring process. I mean, what does that say just now as a whole, not just with athletics, but as Northwestern as a whole in terms of their public image?
Northwestern's public image really cannot get much worse than it looks right now. I mean, the university had made headlines for the wrong reason during football season last year. Just, for example, getting dominated by Illinois in the last game of the season is going to do no favors in terms of the publicity you're going to get. And there was a lot of pressure on Fitzgerald and the team this year to at least probably win 4 games, if not more, for Fitzgerald to really have a chance of keeping his job for solely on the field reasons. But it felt like with every single new hour and additional development would come out in the situation that only made the university look significantly worse. And not just the players, the administrators, really everybody involved in the entire complicated scenario. And as for Greg and the status of his job, I think there was probably valid claim to the fact that he should be fired, but whether or not he will be is a different question, because Northwestern now has to find a new football coach for either 2023 or 2024. Most reports are that it will be for 2024. Very may well have to find a new baseball coach before the 2024 season. But then I'm not sure if Northwestern really wants to have to search for an entire new AD and go through that process when you already are likely to have 2 pretty major coaching searches to undergo. And with football season starting in a little over 50 days for the Wildcats, just from a practicality standpoint, Northwestern may just want to keep Greg for a little bit longer, see how he handles the upcoming next few months, and then decide from there. Just again, because I don't know if they want to have 3 really crucial hires to make in very long, drawn-out search processes all concurring with each other.
I know there was actually a rumor. Sorry, Nick, before you go. I know there was actually a rumor that was recently just debunked, but Nick and I talked about on our episode about Ed Oregon, the former coach of LSU, who very successful as of late down at LSU, how he might be interested in the Northwestern job if it's truly vacant. Obviously, Pat Fitzgerald now suing, or at least teasing that he is going to play some sort of lawsuit as a result of these investigations and his subsequent firing. Obviously, the conflicting reports with Oregon, but I don't know. As a student and as a student journalist and as somebody who's been working on this story, would Oregon be a good hire for Northwestern at this time? And also vice versa, would it be something for Oregon to take on? Should it be something for him to take on?
I'll begin by saying I heard from a source who works very closely with Orgeron that he would have interest, but of course, that, as you guys mentioned, Bruce Feldman of The Athletic, one of the top insiders in the country, amazing sourcing, got to talk to Orgeron himself, and Orgeron said he was not interested. So I would view it as Orgeron not having interest at this point in the job. And from the start, I don't think it really is a good fit for Orgeron. Number one, he's a Louisiana native. He's really only been at some very high-profile market jobs like USC, Ole Miss, LSU, and that Northwestern is just not really on the scale of those programs. And I think in terms of a Northwestern side of things, Orgeron doesn't really make sense either. He's had a litany of scandals in his time at LSU. Part of the reason why he was dismissed at LSU was due to several Title IX violations, and he's kind of had his own salacious behaviors. And I don't think that's the kind of stabilizing force you want to have in your program right now in this type of time. I think a lot of people thought the initial report I put out was so fascinating because it would have been kind of amusing to see Orgeron in the Chicago area and the Chicago suburbs, but I never thought it was a realistic thing that would have occurred. And of course, the source did share with me that Orgeron has not heard from Northwestern. Feldman did confirm that. And I think it's unlikely that Northwestern would hire an outside coach right now, just because, again, it's just a little over 50 days. You have to implement your own playbook, maybe your own staff. Most reports indicate that the team is going to name an interim coach, maybe even David Braun, who's the acting head coach. But no, there's a very minimal chance that Orgeron would ever come to Northwestern.
Now, I want to go back to one of the PR statements, because I think I remember reading like the freshmen have to go through like the dangers of hazing course. I know Tom and I talked about that, and I thought the timing on that was a little bit suspicious at best. After an incident happens, that PR statement comes out, oh, they take a course. Tell me about some of the timing of the statements and how they kind of seem confusing. In a sense. In terms
of the freshmen having to do hazing, dialogue and courses, I think it was the university's attempt to say, well, we're trying to instill these values in our players from the second that they get here. But of course, the flip side of that is, well, just because the players are going through these courses doesn't necessarily mean they're internalizing what they're saying, nor does it mean that it is sticking with them as they move up into their Northwestern careers. And I believe the initial report of running in the Daily Northwestern talked about the fact that it was usually upperclassmen were quote unquote running the younger players. So that certainly would question the report or the statement by the university that, well, yeah, freshmen may be learning about hazing, but does this mean that it's actually being put into use and put into practice? And there might be a disconnect there.
And one thing I just want to follow up with there, do you see the school getting like actual violations from the NCAA, or is this just going to be handled on the inside, do you think?
Knowing Northwestern and that it's a private school, I feel like the university is going to do everything it can to try to handle things internally. And I think that's part of the reason we saw Fitzgerald fired, which the Schill did not say that he had new evidence to fire Fitzgerald. Effectively, he just said that it was a very deliberate reevaluation of the entire situation. And I think that was a smart move on Schill's part, because I don't really think Northwestern had a choice but to fire Fitzgerald. But Northwestern, again, is a school that probably would like to handle things internally as best as it can. That's how it typically tries to operate. And I think the last thing Northwestern wants at this point is an external agency like the NCAA coming in with any type of bans or restrictions, because that would only make things look worse and only put more pressure on Greg and the new coaching staff, or the new coach for 2023 and beyond.
Well, on that note, what do you make of Northwestern's decision to, even though they fired Pat Fitzgerald, they kept on all of the assistants?
I was definitely dubious of that. On one hand, I can understand why, because if Northwestern had let its assistant coaches go, for context, 5 of them are new this entire season, were brought in this offseason by Fitzgerald, had never been in the program really before January. That inherently, I think, was, again, I was skeptical of that, because on one hand, yes, you do need to have enough assistant coaches to adequately field a program. If you don't have all these coaches, you probably can't even go forward with the season. And of course, these coaches probably did not want to go anywhere, because, again, in 50 days, is it likely you're going to join another staff? Probably not. But on the other hand, I think this is really important, that how does the university know that these assistant coaches did not play a role in the hazing behavior? The recent former player I talked to said that the assistant coaches knew, and as he said, everybody else knew in the program that this was happening. So if some of the assistant coaches were responsible for fostering this hazing, they themselves could face their own punishments. And I don't think that Greg nor Schill has properly weighed that and just saying that you guys are allowed to stay on as assistant coaches, and it could be something that plays out further down the line. But in the short term, I see why Northwestern did it. Ethically, though, it's very questionable.
I guess to clarify that, are you also saying too that there's a chance that any of these assistant coaches that were just hired in January, with you saying that they've been extremely new to the program, are you saying that they could have also played a part in this too, which is something that they're are also not weighing, or is that incorrect to assume that?
I think with the new assistant coaches, again, Braun was one of them, the defense coordinator hired in January. It's really just unknown to what extent they may have played a role in hazing because the university's investigation started in December of 2022. I guess one would hope that no hazing occurred after that investigation started, in which case the new assistant coaches likely did not see anything. But again, we can't rule anything out here. And assuming that this was a long-standing issue, and as one player told me, a widespread issue at Northwestern that as he had heard, had been happening for a very long time before just last season. It's hard to just erase those types of quote unquote traditions or manners of players trying to have fun with one another. And just because an investigation was launched, I'm not sure those were halted. So again, I don't think we can rule out any complicit activity of any coaches or anybody affiliated with the program at this point, even those of the players and the coaches that have just come in.
Now, this might be putting the cart before the horse, but with Pat Fitzgerald's situation, do you think he's basically black-eyed from being a head coach? Do you think he'll ever get another opportunity? I know the lawsuit is pending, but do you think he's pretty much done for a while or done permanently?
I don't think he's done permanently. He's still under 50 years old, but I think he definitely will take this upcoming season at the very least to kind of lay low in the media, probably, as you guys mentioned, try to settle the legal situation that he's in. And I think once he has a final resolution from Northwestern, once the two sides come to some agreement, whether it's a settlement or anything like that about the terms of his contract, I think Fitzgerald will reevaluate from there. Of course, part of me thinks that he would never take another job. He was incredibly loyal to Northwestern. That's why he was just such a fan favorite on all sides in the community, because he turned down the NFL multiple times, other high profile jobs he could have been associated with, and said, no, I'm staying at Northwestern as long as I can. But on the other hand, I don't think he's just going to be done coaching altogether. Some might think he could go to the NFL. To me, that's a more winding path for him. He'd probably have to be an assistant in the NFL at first and then hope to be a defensive coordinator at some point before being a head coach. But I think at the end of the day, people understand Fitzgerald's resume. That's why he was getting attention from the next level consistently, and that he was a generally very successful coach at Northwestern and elevating the on-field success of the program, although recently it had not been that case. So I think Fitzgerald will probably coach in college football at some point. Whether it's 2 years from now, 5 years from now, I'm not sure, but I think in the short term, he's probably not likely to coach for now.
So there have been a couple of players who have spoken out with frustrations as of late on social media. Charlie Mangieri basically said, I'll just quote from the tweet here, to zoom in to make a statement like this and leave before allowing time for questions has me baffled. Terrible. Peyton Warford then followed up with a quote tweet, which has since been deleted, by the way. Dr. Greg, President Schill, hope vacation is treating you well. Next time you fire a head coach, make an effort for at least one of you to be there. Goes a long way. Number one, as somebody who is a student reporter, a student journalist, who is watching all this play out and seeing some of these football players frustrated because of Fitzgerald's firing, how do you respond to them? And number two, what do you make of those claims by Warford, deleted as they are, that basically, and Charlie, that basically they just called in, left, and basically zoomed in, left, and just left no time for questions?
I certainly sympathize with the players in this situation. It cannot be easy when the head coach you committed to play college football for at least 4 years was suddenly let go. And from the players' point of view, they probably did not think that anything like this was even possible. They all, I'm sure, knew of the 2-week suspension and thought things would end there. But I think they felt generally blindsided by the administration, that there wasn't a lot of transparency in making the decision to fire Fitzgerald. And again, the most concerning part on their behalf, which was that when Fitzgerald was fired, it sounds like Greg spoke very briefly over Zoom. He was overseas on vacation and then did not allow for questions. And that's just, again, a really bad look on Greg's part. Again, if your head coach were fired, you would have lots of questions. And that's why I think we saw so many players so outraged with the university. And I know Greg met with the team Tuesday, I believe. Not exactly sure what the details of that meeting were. I believe ESPN's Rittenberg did provide some of them. But for now, I think it's players deciding whether or not they still want to be part of Northwestern under the guise of leadership of Schill and Greg, with Fitzgerald no longer there. And I should again add, Fitzgerald was a very compelling reason to play at Northwestern for the vast majority, if not all, of these players.
For sure. Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Zain. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was also just going to follow up too, obviously with Big Ten Media Days coming up in a couple of weeks in Indianapolis, what do you think the vibe is going to be, at Northwestern availability? Do you think it's going to be all about the Fitzgerald situation? Do you think the reporters are going to try to more so shift and change their perspective to the upcoming 2023 season? What do you think that's going to be like in a couple of weeks, just considering that there hasn't been a changeover at the head coaching position since February of 2006. So all of this is going to look very new. So I was just curious to get your perspective on that, because I know that that's always highly anticipated every year with usually 3 representatives from each team. Tell me what you think that'll be like and what to expect.
I think it'd be hard to say anything except the fact that it's going to be a good number of questions about the Hazing situation. Northwestern is sending 3 veteran players, Bryce Gallagher, Rod Hurd, and Bryce Kurtz, who all seemingly will stay at the program. At least one would figure, if they're going to be speaking at Big Ten Media Days. Of course, the team does have a 30-day transfer portal window, which will expire in August if players do want to depart. But in terms of what those players are going to be asked, it's likely going to be, did they ever witness hazing? Were they ever involved in any acts of hazing? Did they see Fitzgerald make the quote-unquote Shrek clap? I'm sure there'll also be a lot of questions about how they felt when they heard the news about Fitzgerald being fired, how they feel about the university. And I'm sure a lot of players are not going to mince words, as you guys mentioned, Mangieri and Warford were just 2 of them to come forward on social media. We might get players saying that they were very disappointed in the university and that they did not feel they were protected by administration. And then, of course, the other elephant in the room is who is going to be the coach that Northwestern sends. There was some expectation that potentially an interim coach could be named by the end of this week, as I think I mentioned. And I would expect Braun to be named the interim head coach just because he was named the acting head coach, even though he only got there in January. So if Braun is at Big Ten Media Days, that is not going to be an easy position for him, fielding questions about not only the Fitzgerald scandal and his involvement in hazing, but also he's never been a coordinator at the Power 5 level in any capacity. Now he's likely expected to be a head coach of a Big Ten team. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions about his transition and his comfort level. So Northwestern is going to go from one of, I guess, the least talked about, least controversial programs of the Big Ten Media Days to maybe the most in terms of reporters' attention.
Now, final one for me, and Bradley, we really appreciate your time spending with us, because you've been all over the place covering this story. We talked about reputation earlier. I want to talk more about, I guess, the future of the athletics in a sense. Are they going to have a problem now with recruiting and all this? Because people are going to see big allegation scandal. Do I really want to be an athlete at Northwestern? You started to talk about the portal. Do you think more of these football players or even the baseball players now with that are going to find their way out and newer athletes are not going to want to come here?
I'll start with baseball, and I as of now, the transfer portal has already been just chock full of Northwestern players. I think it's 16 Northwestern players are in the transfer portal, which closes tonight. Many of them already found new destinations, including some high-level programs like Maryland and Michigan. So baseball, I think, as long as Foster is still there, a good number of players are not going to want to play for Northwestern. It's easy to understand why in light of the culture that he created. In terms of football, we've already seen, I believe it is now 4 decommitments from class of 2024 recruits. I believe they were all 3-star prospects, but I do expect that a good number of players will enter the transfer portal even in this 30-day window, if not after the season. Again, from a player standpoint, you can understand why it is difficult, because you only have 50 days. How feasible is it to find a new destination, to get acclimated in time, to get to training camp, to get set up even with your own living situation at a new university? That doesn't seem simple. But on the other hand, again, Fitzgerald was so integral to these players and basically was, again, just beloved by the players. And now that he's no longer there, I'm sure a lot of them don't have as many motivations to stay at Northwestern. Again, the team was not expected to be good this year, had lost a significant number of talented players, brought in some intriguing transfers, but it was viewed as going to be another long year for Northwestern football. And that has only gotten more daunting with Fitzgerald not there. If you're a player and you don't want to be part of that, there's definitely incentive to want to leave. The question will just be, what better opportunities can you find? And for a lot of these players, I'm sure, I believe one former commit has already committed to Wisconsin. Other high-profile teams are going to start calling and say, well, we heard about you're not at Northwestern. Why don't you come join us? We don't have these levels of scandals or this level of utility on the field. So lots of intrigue there. And again, we're far from seeing the end of that.
You make mention of the program coming off of a season where they only had one win, losing multiple talents, that this stretches over to athletics just as a whole. I mean, there are some people who are saying basically maybe Northwestern shouldn't even just take the field this season, which is a little controversial to say when you're a Big Ten program. The Big Ten is such a power conference in college sports. What do you say to that?
I can understand where those people are coming from for sure. I mean, at least for me as a reporter, and I think many of my fellow editorial staff members at InsideNU, we don't really feel like it's an appropriate time to talk about the actual gridiron play of Northwestern of, oh, who's going to be the starting quarterback, who's going to fill this position, because there's such a cloud looming overhead that, again, is still so raw for a lot of people and has deeply affected basically every side involved. But at some point, Northwestern is going to look to turn the page and try to play a season. But I think, again, it's going to be very difficult for everybody involved, whether it's a coach or a player, to just seemingly forget about what's happening. I mean, if you're 0-6 in the middle of the season and you're thinking, well, where's Fitzgerald to energize us on the sideline? That's kind of proof in and of itself that, again, the legacy of Fitzgerald has not been forgotten, and that the team can't just snap its fingers and move on. So I can understand definitely why there's thought that the team shouldn't even play. But I think from a profit standpoint, as you guys talked about, it would be very unlikely that Schill, who came from Oregon, which is another very high profile athletics school, would have just said, we're not going to garner that revenue this year. But again, from an ethical standpoint, lots of validity to the fact that they probably should not be playing this year. And assuming they do play, it's not going to feel like a normal season in any respect, nor should it.
And my last question to you is just as somebody who is a student of journalism, who's somebody who is a co-editor chief of the InsideNU, who is studying this field, what can you say about just the power of student journalism or journalism as a whole when it comes to, the kind of mass story that is being produced here?
I can't emphasize it enough just how important a role the journalists played in this story, especially as you mentioned, students. The Daily Northwestern's report is what really catalyzed the entire situation. And again, I can't be more grateful and appreciative for the players that had the bravery to speak up and that trusted the reporters on all sides, especially those that were students. I think it has been a really valuable learning experience for everybody going forward about how to handle a situation that's this delicate and this complex. And I don't think, of course, you could say the Daily Northwestern was the most integral, but I don't think you can discount the reporting of anybody, whether it's InsideNU, ESPN, Wildcat Report, and allowing the truth to be uncovered. And I think also it shows the power of sources. Of course, some have said, well, these sources are anonymous, therefore they're discounted. But people need to remember that these are human beings. These are players that if their names were associated with this, they could get blackballed by their former teammates. And we as journalists have a responsibility to protect the people who are sharing this very graphic information with us. So it's not necessarily just as simple as, well, if they're not putting their name on it, maybe it didn't happen. That is a very short-sighted point of view, and that only reinforces a culture that does not allow for the truth to come out and only seems to put a stigma on those who speak out. So again, the work of journalists cannot be emphasized enough, especially student journalism and showcases, especially at a place like Medill, which is very special. The ability of journalists to uncover what actually happened, and even to bring down a figure like Fitzgerald, who seemed untouchable.
Bradley Locker, co-editor-in-chief of InsideNU, Northwestern Medill School of Journalism class of 2025. You can follow him on Twitter at Bradley_Locker. Bradley, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks again, guys, for having me.